This is the first lecture of 3 that's going to talk about political parties and elections. So we're first going to talk about political parties, and the third lecture will deal mainly with the elections. So this is a painting showing Andrew Jackson coming into the office of the presidency, and he was a Democrat, and the Democratic Party of the United States is the world's oldest political party. It can trace its history back to Thomas Jefferson's Jeffersonian Republicans and later to Andrew Jackson's Jacksonian Democrats. The Jacksonians expanded voter participation and ushered in the political era of the common person, as shown in this image of Jackson's inaugural celebration. So we're going to hear a lot of different names of different parties that existed in U.S. history, and we'll show how they evolved over time. So here are the objectives. Part 1 is going to talk about the definition of a political party, understand the concept of levels of party, and then we're going to talk about the purpose and functions of parties in America. The second lecture will look at the history of parties in the United States and explain so that you can understand why there is a two-party system in America. And then the third part will deal more with the elections and how people vote in U.S. elections. All right. Well, let's just start with defining a party. The elephant is the icon for the Republican Party, and the donkey is symbolic of the Democratic Party. So when you see those two figures, that's what that's talking about. So what is a political party? One way to think about a political party is that it's an ongoing coalition of interests joined together in an effort to get its candidates for public office under a common label. Okay, so that's just one definition. A political party is an ongoing coalition of interests joined together in an effort to get its candidates for public office under a common label. Definitions differ depending on the source you use, so there's several key words that are most common for you to think about. One is it's a coalition. That means in a political party there are coalitions of people who work together. And so if you think about the Democratic Party in terms of its coalition, it has women, minorities, workers, the union. If you think about the GOP or the Republican Party, they also have different coalitions. Big business, more wealthy, more men than women. So you have these different coalitions. Parties are organized formally. They have structure, and we'll talk about how parties are organized momentarily. And they cooperate to achieve a goal, mainly elections. So again, if we think about this definition, it's an ongoing coalition of interests. These different groups within the party have interests, and they join together. They organize formally in order to get some shared political goal achieved, and that's mainly getting candidates for public office. Okay. There are different levels of party. Many people refer to this as the three-headed giant. So there's 3 meanings or 3 levels of party. First is the party in the electorate. And we've talked a little bit about this before, and this is where people identify with one political party or another. This is party affiliation or party identification or party ID. So party in the electorate really just refers to those who identify with a certain party. It has a psychological attachment. People identify themselves oftentimes by the political party. And remember, we talked this last week about the idea that voters often don't have a lot of knowledge about the candidate, and sometimes they won't even know that candidate's name. You're going to go into the voting booth this November, and there's going to be a long ballot. By the time you get toward the bottom where you're putting in your vote for city council and the justice of the peace and judges and even some representatives. You're not going to know very much about them, but sometimes you'll have an idea of what they stand for because you can identify with the party affiliation. So this is oftentimes a voting cue for you in the voting booth. Even if you don't know much about a particular candidate, you can make some general conclusions about what they would vote for or how they would vote based on their party ID. And we measure party affiliation all the time. One of the leading organizations that gather data and do a lot of polling is the Michigan PID measure, the party ID measure. And so this is an ongoing survey that's asked pretty regularly, and they will ask the person, do you usually think of yourself as a Democrat, Republican, or what? And then they'll ask a more specific question, do you consider yourself a strong or not so strong Democrat or Republican? And then they'll ask whether or not you feel like you're leaning toward one or the other. Do you consider yourself to be closer to the Democratic Party or the Republican, or neither? So what happens is oftentimes, and this is just from the 2004 Party ID data, is that this Democrat and Independent and Republican numbers, as you see here, are gleaned from some numbers over here. So for a Democrat, they put the strong and the weak Democrat percentage together. The Independents, they put these three together, and then the Republicans, they put these together, generally speaking. Okay, and so we see the trend that the rise of independence, that people are starting to increase their level of identification as an independent. So the Democratic and the Republicans are losing voters as we move forward. And you can see that if we, when it comes to just identifying themselves as a Republican or a Democrat, more people tend to identify themselves as a Democrat. And so you can track this. Gallup tracks people's vote. Are they Democrat or leaning Democrat? And you can see over the years people are moving away from the parties and more people are becoming independent or refuse to answer that question. All right. And so you can see there was a rise of independence in the 1950s and 60s into the 70s. Republican identification tended to drop after the Eisenhower years. There has been a decline. This is the Reagan influence in the 1980s, and then a dip from the Bush years. And you can see in the middle of the 20th century, a majority identified themselves as Democrats. This has declined over time. Okay. So by the 2004, neither the Democrats or the Republicans had enough vote to hold on to elections. They had to get some of this independent voting. So you'll see in the primaries, what we're seeing right now is that the Republicans are really hitting hard on those right-wing issues. The Democrats, we don't hear much about their primary because the presumptive nominee is obviously President Obama. After the primaries open, and when you have Obama running against probably Mitt Romney, you're going to see them coming more toward the middle ideologically to try and capture some of these independent voters. All right. We can also see by different groups, and we'll close the third lecture looking a little bit at this as well. And you can see that Democrats and these different groups tend to dominate, and so except for males in general. But women prefer the Democrats 55 to 34%. When it comes to breaking it down in the age, the older you get, it tends to be the more conservative you kind of lean toward. Race, you can see here that blacks are overwhelmingly supportive of the Democratic Party, and there's a split, and there's a fierce independent movement in the white population. Education, as you become more educated, the rise of, the independent tends to decline, and so you tend to have more affiliation with one party or the other as you become more educated. And household income, you can see as income goes up, you tend to be more affiliated with the Republican Party, and you can see some regional differences as well. Okay, but by and large, Democrats tend to dominate, which should signal that Democrats should win more elections than Republicans, but that's not the case, and we can talk about that as we go through the lecture. All right, so that's party identification. Who identifies with what party? All right. The second level talks about the party as an organization. One thing you should write down is that parties in America are weak and decentralized relative to their European counterparts. Even though we have a whole political system based on the party as an organization is weak. It can't tell its members how to vote. And unless you continuously vote against the party, if you're an elected official, let's say that you're a House member and you're a Democrat, but you consistently vote for the Republicans in voting, you may lose your seat in the next election, and you may lose favor with the Democratic leadership, but they can't kick you out, for example. So the party in America is not nearly as organized as in many countries, and not nearly as centralized. So we have weak and decentralized parties. In the American federalist system, we have city government, county, state, national. So the power is decentralized. That means it's spread over these different levels of government. So there's substantial political power at each of these levels. And so the parties organize on these levels as well, and so the power is dispersed between the national, state, county, and city governments. And so as in the federalist system, the different levels are, and to an extent, independent from each other. So are the political parties. But at the national level, certain guidelines are set so that the states need to follow. So for example, when it comes to choosing delegates to the National Convention, they're going to try and have a uniform system of how that works out. They can choose to have a primary like most states do, or a caucus like Iowa, but as a regulation, for example, of the Democratic Party, that the meeting or polling places should be well publicized in advance. So there is some oversight, but generally speaking, parties are weak and decentralized in the American system. And then third, there's the party in government. So once you elect your representative or senators, they go off to Washington. The party is important to that particular elected official for two reasons. First, it gives them a cue for voting for how they're supposed to vote on certain issues. And so, but like I said, this is a weak cue for people in office because they don't always have to follow the leadership, because you have some conservative Democrats and you have some more moderate Republicans who may not vote along party lines. Okay, but like a voter, he can't always be well informed on all the issues. And so that's why the party is going to serve as a cue for voting for these elected officials. Okay. Second, it determines what kind of committee assignment they're going to get. We talked about committees when we talked about Congress, but remember, if you're the majority party, and right now the Republicans are in the House, that means you get to choose who are the chairs of those committees. So committee assignment is based upon parties. All right. All right, so those are the three levels of party. Party in the electorate, party as an organization, and then party in government. And then this right here is important to show you how these different party levels interact with one another. So the party as an organization recruits candidates and provides campaign resources to parties in government. Okay, so the party organization is going to help out those elected officials by recruiting candidates and providing campaign funds. In response, the party in government responds to the policy views and helps strengthen the party organization. So these two things work hand in hand. The party in the electorate, the people, elects the party in government, and in order to stay in government, they have to respond to the policy views of the party in the electorate, or they might get voted out next time around. The party as an organization helps to mobilize this electorate, and oftentimes people who are in the electorate will work as a volunteer, for example, in the party organization. So you'll want to pay attention to how these three groups interact with one another in terms of levels of party. All right, what is the main purpose of parties? What do they do? First and foremost, they're designed to win elections. A party's ability to recruit the strongest candidates and to win elections was going to determine its success. So it's in the party's best interest to try and recruit the strongest candidates. And recently, the argument is that the parties aren't able to attract the best candidates, and because some of the best people just simply don't want to run for election. Okay? We think about how many millions of people there are in the United States, but we can't find really quality candidates to run on a regular basis because they don't want to basically endure the political process involved with a political election. But there's other functions besides winning elections, and as the text indicates, and as our graph indicated, parties are going to try and go and recruit candidates. And the types of individuals that both parties are trying to recruit now are veterans, people who served in Iraq and Afghanistan. You're finding them more and more getting engaged in the political process in terms of being a candidate for office. They help organize the nominations, and then they help get out the vote. So again, it's those three things that we showed you on the graph before, the three different ways the different party levels are interacting with one another. They recruit candidates, organize nominations, and then get out the vote. Okay. So let's look at this a little bit more in depth. All right. So the parties have to organize and run the government. All right. So again, they make committee assignments. They hopefully will ensure party members are voting along party lines. But party voting in the U.S. Congress is not nearly as prevalent as in other countries like the United Kingdom. In the United Kingdom, it is somewhat unusual to see a member of the House of Commons vote against his party line. In the United States, this happens all the time, and that's the job of the party whip, to really whip the ranks into shape and have them vote along party lines. But oftentimes, again, I know I'm repeating myself, individual Congress people, members, will not vote with the party because they're either in a district that's a little bit more conservative or a little bit more liberal, depending upon the particular issue. The function of the party is to build coalitions, and again, it's an alliance of group of people with differing interests for the purpose of furthering their common goals. So one of the best known coalitions is the New Deal coalition that FDR put together in the 1930s. You have to unify groups and their interests in order to try and build a coalition so that you can win in elections and then organize the government. And so one of the challenges of the Republican Party right now is how they're building a coalition. There's really kind of a split in the Republican Party between the Tea Party group and the mainstream Republicans. And so how are they going to unify these groups and how are they going to unify their interests is one of the questions that's always commented on in the political sphere. And then they want to help simplify policies and shape public opinion. And so this is where they have to develop public policy, and they want to develop a party platform. And a party platform is simply the statements of the philosophy, of the policy orientation. It's basically what the party stands for in terms of the public policies that it wants to support. And you might think that the parties and candidates take the platform seriously. The delegates do, the people who go and write the party platform at the nomination, but the fact of the matter is that once the presidential election starts, the platform is for the most part a forgotten and rather unimportant piece of paper. It's probably taken seriously by the presidential candidate and congressional candidates, but it certainly isn't all that relevant to a particular candidate's chance of getting elected, and a candidate will take stances in a disagreement with the party platform to improve their chances of getting elected. All right, well, let's take a break here. I wanted to show you this because we're going to start talking about the different political parties in American history. And these parties, while they exist in the United States, these are considered third parties. We're going to talk about the two major parties and how they evolved over time. But keep in mind, we do have third parties in the United States, but they are never really going to win an election. And we'll talk about why that's the case in the next lecture.